My name is Nia, 32 years old, and somehow still healing from the wounds my family inflicted. As a successful private equity executive, I escaped their toxicity, but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale housewarming party to celebrate my sister. Between glasses of expensive champagne and catered appetizers, my sister leaned forward, smirking into a microphone. You know, Nia, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way. Not everyone can afford a $2 million villa. I simply sipped my drink and smiled. That night, I logged into my company portal, initiated the eviction process for that exact villa, and emailed my lawyer about foreclosing on our parents' house. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling brick home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and grand columns was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale pink, at my mother Beatrice's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and my prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight grades, joined honor societies, and did everything possible to earn a fraction of the praise effortlessly showered upon my older sister Chantel. Chantel was the golden child. She possessed a natural flair for high society politics, perfectly molding herself into the image of a prestigious pastor's daughter. My father, Pastor Thomas, led one of the most prominent congregations in the city. Image was everything. In our household, looking successful mattered far more than actually being successful. I was the quiet, analytical one, the daughter who preferred reading financial reports over attending church galas. My parents viewed my introversion as a social liability. They constantly reminded me that I needed to be more like Chantel, more vibrant, more focused on landing a husband with a respectable title. That relentless pressure reached its peak at Chantel's extravagant housewarming party in the exclusive neighborhood of Buckhead. I had not wanted to attend. Family gatherings always left me feeling drained, reduced to the scapegoat they could collectively mock to feel better about their own insecurities. But my Aunt Vivica, my mother's sister, and the only relative who saw through their polished facade, had convinced me to go. She promised to be my human shield, and I knew her sharp tongue would keep the worst of my mother's comments at bay. I arrived at the sprawling modern villa just as the sun began to set. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles, and the front doors stood wide open, spilling warm light and loud laughter into the evening air. I stepped inside, carrying a modest gift bag containing a set of high-quality kitchen knives. I deliberately wore a simple, unbranded beige dress. It was made of pure silk and cost more than most people's monthly rent, but to my brand-obsessed family, it lacked the flashy logos they associated with wealth. The living room was a sea of familiar faces, from the church congregation and extended relatives. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with silver trays of appetizers. At the center of the room, standing on the bottom step of a sweeping marble staircase, was Chantel. She wore a sparkling emerald gown that screamed for attention. Her husband Darius stood beside her, flashing his expensive watch and talking loudly about real estate investments to anyone who would listen. Darius was a charismatic man who drove a leased Maserati and always seemed to have a new get-rich-quick scheme. My parents adored him because he played the part of the successful, wealthy son-in-law flawlessly. I tried to slip into the room unnoticed, hoping to drop my gift on the entry table and retreat to a quiet corner with Aunt Vivica. But Chantel possessed a radar for my presence. The moment I set foot on the marble floor, her eyes locked onto me. She tapped her champagne glass with a silver spoon, demanding the attention of the entire room. "Thank you all for coming to bless our new home," Chantel announced, her voice amplified by a sleek microphone she had apparently rented for the occasion. "Darius and I are so grateful for God's favor. We always knew we were destined for greatness, and standing in this $2 million villa just proves that hard work and faith pay off." The crowd murmured in agreement. Pastor Thomas beamed from the front row, his chest puffed out with pride. Then Chantel's gaze drifted pointedly toward me. Her smile sharpened into something malicious. I want to give a special shout out to my little sister Nia for making it tonight. Chantel's voice dripped with condescension as the guests turned to look at me. I know you struggle with your little desk jobs, Nia, so you really did not have to stretch your tight budget to bring a gift. We appreciate the effort, though. Not everyone can afford to live in a villa like this at my age, but maybe if you prayed a little harder and complained a little less, you would find a nice man to take care of you too. Laughter erupted across the living room. It was not polite, subdued laughter. It was the loud, validating laughter of a church community that had been conditioned to view me as the family failure. I felt my cheeks heat up, but I kept my posture straight and my expression entirely neutral. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. Before I could even process the humiliation, my mother Beatrice marched over to me. She did not offer a hug or a warm greeting. Instead, she aggressively yanked at the collar of my silk dress, her face contorted in disapproval. "Why could you not wear something presentable?" Beatrice hissed, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "You are embarrassing Darius in front of the head deacons. He just closed a massive commercial deal to buy this gorgeous house, and you show up looking like you bought your outfit from a discount rack. You always have to ruin Chantel's moments with your sloppy presentation." I looked at my mother, absorbing the familiar sting of her rejection. For years I would have apologized. I would have shrunk into myself and found a place to hide. But today was different. I simply brushed her hand away from my collar and offered a polite, icy smile. Suddenly, the clinking of ice against crystal cut through the lingering laughter in the room. Aunt Vivica stepped forward from the shadows of the dining area. She held a glass of bourbon, her posture relaxed but radiating absolute authority. She looked my sister up and down, then turned her gaze to me, speaking loudly enough for the microphone to pick up her voice. "Is that why you just paid all cash for a 5-bedroom mansion in Tuxedo Park last week?" Nia Vivica asked, her tone conversational, but laced with deadly precision. "Because I was under the impression that dropping $4 million in cash meant you were doing just fine without a man to take care of you." The music seemed to completely stop. The joyful chatter died instantly, replaced by a suffocating heavy silence. Dozens of eyes snapped back and forth between Aunt Vivica and me. The church elders stopped chewing their appetizers. My father's proud smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer confusion. Chantel scoffed, rolling her eyes and gripping the microphone tighter. "Do not be ridiculous, Aunt Vivica. You must have had too much bourbon. Nia buying a mansion in Tuxedo Park. She can barely afford her rent. Stop making up stories to make her feel better." But Darius was not laughing. While Chantel continued to mock the idea, Darius stared fixedly at the leather portfolio sticking out of the tote bag I carried. I had brought some paperwork from my office to review later, and the gold-embossed logo of my private equity firm was clearly visible on the cover. Darius suddenly went completely pale. His hands began to shake violently. The crystal champagne glass slipped from his fingers, hitting the marble floor and shattering into dozens of sharp, glittering pieces. He recognized the logo. He recognized the company that held the deed to the very house he was standing in. The sound of the breaking glass echoed sharply, drawing every single eye in the crowded room directly toward him. The confident, wealthy real estate investor facade he had maintained all evening evaporated in an instant. He looked absolutely terrified, his breathing ragged and shallow as he stared at the golden emblem. He knew immediately that his entire elaborate web of hidden financial lies was about to be completely, utterly, and permanently destroyed forever. The severe consequences of his deceit were standing right in front of him, armed with absolute power and the legal right to take everything away from him. For months, he had successfully fooled everyone, convincing the church congregation that he was a brilliant businessman. He played the role of the perfect son-in-law, basking in the endless praise my parents freely offered him. But now, as his shaking hands reached out for the cold granite countertop to steady his trembling body, that illusion completely shattered alongside his broken glass. The sharp sound of crystal shattering against the marble floor echoed through the sprawling living room. Guests gasped, stepping back, as expensive champagne splattered across the pristine white stone. Darius stood frozen. His eyes were wide with pure terror, fixated on the embossed logo of my private equity firm resting in my tote bag. He did not bend down to clean up the mess. He did not apologize to the guests. He just stared, completely paralyzed by the sudden realization that his house of cards was rapidly collapsing. Chantel, however, was completely oblivious to her husband's panic. She looked at the broken glass, let out an annoyed sigh, and immediately turned her fury back toward me. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure resentment. She gripped her microphone tightly, her knuckles turning white. "You are absolutely pathetic," Nia Chantel sneered, her voice echoing through the speakers and bouncing off the high ceilings. "You come into my new home, a house my successful husband bought for me, and you have Aunt Vivica make up some ridiculous lie about you buying a mansion in Tuxedo Park. You are so jealous of my life that you have to invent fairy tales just to steal my spotlight. It is actually sad. You have always been bitter because I have the lifestyle you could never achieve." The surrounding guests, mostly deacons and wealthy members of my father's congregation, nodded in agreement. They murmured their disapproval, casting judgmental glances in my direction. They had spent years buying into the narrative my parents sold them. It was the story of Chantel, the blessed golden child, and Nia, the difficult, rebellious disappointment. Before I could respond, my father, Pastor Thomas, stepped forward. He raised his hands in a gesture of false peace, utilizing the exact same authoritative posture he used when delivering his Sunday sermons to thousands of devoted followers every single week. He was a man who demanded absolute obedience from his family and his congregation, completely intolerant of any challenge to his carefully curated public image. He walked toward me, his face set in a look of profound disappointment, wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than my first car. "Nia, this behavior is unacceptable under God's roof," my father announced, projecting his voice so the entire room could hear his righteous judgment. "The sin of envy is a poison that will rot your soul from the inside out. Your sister and your brother-in-law have worked tirelessly to earn these massive blessings. Darius is a top-tier real estate investor. He provides for your sister in a way you should deeply admire, not covet. Instead of rejoicing in their prosperity, you bring lies and disruption into their beautiful new home. You need to apologize to Chantel immediately and ask the Lord to cleanse your heart of this toxic jealousy." I looked at my father. For a brief second, I felt a familiar ache in my chest. This was the man who was supposed to fiercely protect me. Yet he was publicly humiliating me to elevate a son-in-law who was actively scamming him. I glanced at Darius, who was still gripping the edge of the kitchen island, sweating profusely, unable to meet my father's eyes. "I am not experiencing any envy, Dad," I replied, my voice steady and dangerously calm. "I am simply bringing a heavy dose of reality to a party built entirely on illusions." My mother Beatrice pushed her way to the front of the crowd. She glared at me, her eyes flashing with a highly predatory gleam. If she believed even a fraction of Aunt Vivica's claim about my wealth, her immediate instinct was not to congratulate me, but to extract massive profit. "If you really have all this money suddenly," Beatrice demanded, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, "then you need to prove it right now. You walked in here with a cheap set of kitchen knives for a sister who just moved into a $2 million villa. If you are supposedly buying mansions in Tuxedo Park in cash, then you owe this family a proper blessing. You need to write your sister a check for $20,000 right now to help furnish this massive house." Aunt Vivica let out a sharp, mocking laugh from the corner of the room, but my mother ignored her, stepping aggressively closer to me. "You owe us," Nia Beatrice hissed, her voice dripping with extreme entitlement. "We raised you. We put a roof over your head when you were a small child. We tolerated your incredibly difficult personality. If you have stumbled into some money, it is your duty as a Black woman to elevate your family. Write the check and prove you are not just a bitter liar trying to ruin your sister's special night. Otherwise, you can take your cheap gift bag and walk right out that front door." The sheer audacity of her demand hung heavily in the air. The church elders watched me expectantly, fully supporting my mother's twisted logic. In their eyes, any success I had ever achieved belonged to the family collective, specifically to fund Chantel's lavish lifestyle. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of the intense anger simmering beneath my calm exterior. I simply reached into my tote bag and slowly pulled out the heavy leather-bound folder. I walked deliberately toward the massive marble kitchen island, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. The crowd parted slightly, sensing a major shift in the atmosphere. Darius squeezed his eyes shut tightly, desperately praying for an escape. He looked as though he was about to be physically sick right there. I placed the folder down gently on the cool marble surface. I ran my hand over the golden emblem of my private equity firm, ensuring every single person in the front row could clearly see the corporate seal. I do not write blessing checks to celebrate a rented lifestyle. I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the sudden heavy silence. And I certainly do not hand over my hard-earned money to furnish a property that does not actually belong to the people hosting this party. Chantel let out a piercing, utterly hysterical laugh. She marched aggressively over to the massive imported marble kitchen island, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "You are completely delusional!" Chantel screamed, her flawless facade cracking under the weight of her sudden rage. "Darius bought this house outright. He closed the deal last month. Everyone in our church knows he is a master real estate investor. You are just a pathetic, lonely spinster trying to tear down my perfect marriage because no man will ever buy a spectacular villa for you. Tell her, Darius. Tell her you own this spectacular house." She turned to her husband, desperately waiting for him to validate her reality. But Darius could not speak a single word. He stood totally frozen, staring at the leather folder as if it were a loaded weapon aimed directly at his chest. When Darius failed to answer, a huge wave of confusion rippled through the bewildered guests. Pastor Thomas frowned deeply, looking from his silent son-in-law to my unnervingly calm face. "Darius, tell your sister-in-law to leave immediately," my father ordered, his highly authoritative voice faltering just slightly. Darius swallowed hard, a thick bead of sweat tracing down his temple, but he remained absolutely mute. The silence stretched, becoming more unbearable with every passing second. The clinking of silverware and the soft jazz music that had been playing in the background felt entirely out of place against the raw, suffocating anxiety radiating from Darius. My mother Beatrice narrowed her eyes, stepping closer to inspect the folder I had placed on the island. She still firmly believed she held the upper hand, deeply convinced that her golden child could never be involved in a massive scam. Her blind faith in superficial wealth was about to become her ultimate undoing, a spectacular public downfall she brought completely upon herself. I reached out and flipped the leather folder open. I slid a thick, legally binding document across the marble counter directly toward my sister and my parents. The bold heading at the very top of the page read, "Commercial Lease Agreement and Rent-to-Own Contract." Darius did not buy anything I said, my voice slicing through the thick tension like a freshly sharpened blade. He did not close a massive commercial deal, and he certainly does not hold the official deed to this property. He signed a highly predatory rent-to-own lease with a 15% penalty clause because his credit is completely destroyed. Chantel stared blankly at the stack of legal paperwork. Her eyes darted wildly across the signatures, instantly recognizing her husband's messy scrawl at the very bottom of the page. She shook her head in furious denial, her hands trembling violently as she grabbed the contract off the counter. "This is fake," Chantel shouted, though her loud voice wavered with sudden terrifying doubt. "You forged this garbage. Darius would never ever sign something like this. He owns this gorgeous house." I leaned forward, resting my hands confidently on the marble counter, looking directly into my sister's deeply panicked eyes. "Read the name of the holding company at the top of the lease," Chantel I instructed softly. "And do you know who currently owns the private equity firm that holds the actual deed to this spectacular villa?" I smiled coldly, thoroughly enjoying the horrific realization washing over her face. "I do." The two simple words hung suspended in the lavish kitchen, striking with the blunt force of a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd of deacons and society friends. The silence that followed was absolute. I kept my eyes locked on my sister, watching the arrogant certainty drain from her face, replaced by a frantic, wild confusion. Chantel lunged forward, her emerald silk gown rustling as she snatched the heavy lease agreement right off the marble island. Her manicured fingers flipped past the cover page, her eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text. She was desperately searching for a loophole, anything to prove I was lying. But the paperwork was flawless. There, printed in bold black ink, was the name of my limited liability company, listed clearly as the sole property owner and landlord. No, Chantel whispered, her voice cracking as she stared at the signature page. This makes absolutely no sense. Darius, what is this? She spun around to face her husband. Darius had retreated 2 steps back, putting physical distance between himself and the damning documents. He looked like a man on the gallows. Tell her it is a fake, Darius, Chantel demanded, her pitch rising into a shrill, hysterical frequency. Tell her she forged this. Tell them you bought this house for us. When he simply swallowed hard and refused to meet her gaze, Chantel snapped. She stepped forward and slapped him flat against his chest with the back of the legal packet. The sharp thwack echoed in the quiet room. Explain this to me right now, Chantel screamed, hitting his chest a second time. Why does my sister have lease documents with your signature on them? Why does her company own our house? Darius flinched, raising his hands in a pathetic attempt to pacify his enraged wife. He wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, flashing a weak smile toward the church elders watching his every move. He adjusted his designer blazer, cleared his throat, and attempted to turn his massive financial failure into a calculated business move. Baby, calm down. Darius started putting on his salesman voice. It is not what it looks like. You do not understand commercial real estate. This is a temporary corporate restructuring strategy. I put the property in a trust vehicle to protect our assets from liability taxes. It is a strategic leaseback program. I am just leveraging alternative private equity to maximize our portfolio returns. We still control the asset. He looked around the room, hoping his buzzwords would blind the deacons to the reality of his bankruptcy. The deacons simply stared back at him with cold, calculating eyes. They were not fools. They could easily smell the desperation rolling off Darius in thick, suffocating waves. He was drowning, and his pathetic attempt to use corporate jargon only made him look far more foolish. It is just business, brothers, Darius pleaded, his voice cracking slightly. You all know how the market fluctuates. I am playing the long game here. I let out a sharp, cold laugh that instantly shattered his desperate charade. You are not playing a long game, Darius, I corrected him, my voice carrying across the large room. You are completely broke. You lost your real estate broker license last year after the state investigation into your fraudulent escrow accounts. No traditional bank in Georgia will lend you a single dime. You came to my private equity firm through a shell corporation to beg for a high-interest rent-to-own loan to maintain the illusion of wealth for your wife. You had absolutely no idea I was the chief executive officer sitting behind the corporate veil. Darius deflated instantly, his shoulders sagging as the final remnants of his pride evaporated. He looked down at his expensive Italian loafers, completely defeated. The guests began whispering furiously among themselves. Aunt Vivica took a slow, highly satisfied sip of her bourbon, leaning against the grand architectural archway with a smug, knowing smile. She had patiently waited years to see this deeply toxic facade crumble into dust. She raised her glass slightly in my direction, a silent salute to the absolute destruction I was currently unleashing upon the very people who had tried to break me. But instead of directing his righteous fury at the son-in-law who had just humiliated the family, my father, Pastor Thomas, turned his wrath entirely on me. He could not handle the public destruction of his perfect family image. He needed a scapegoat, and as always, I was the designated target. Pastor Thomas marched up to the kitchen island, his face red with terrifying anger. The heavy gold cross resting on his chest swayed violently with his rapid movements. He pointed a heavy accusatory finger directly at my face. "How dare you, Naya?" my father bellowed, his voice vibrating with pastoral fury. "How dare you become a predatory landlord and prey on your brother-in-law?" You sat back and watched him struggle, and instead of offering him a helping hand, you trapped him in a high-interest lease just to humiliate him in front of our church family. You are a disgrace to the values of this household. I stared at the man who had always chosen maintaining public appearances over protecting his own daughter. You will fix this immediately, my father ordered, slamming his fist down on the marble counter. You have money now. You will transfer this deed directly to Chantel by tomorrow morning. You will wipe out Darius's debt and hand this property over to your sister free and clear. That is what family does. Family protects family. I was demanding a $2 million asset as a gift to reward their bullying. I looked at Chantel, who suddenly stopped crying. A greedy, hopeful spark ignited in her eyes. She actually believed my father could bully me into handing over a mansion. I squared my shoulders, looking my father dead in the eye. Family protects family. I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that commanded the attention of every person in the room. Is that right, Dad? I took a step closer to him, refusing to back down from his intimidating posture. Is that exactly like how you protected me when I was 19 years old? I asked, letting the raw history of their abuse finally spill out into the open. Because I vividly remember working 2 grueling shifts at the diner to save up for my college tuition. I remember coming home to find my bank account completely drained. You forged my signature on those banking documents, drained my entire college savings account, and used every single penny of my hard-earned money to pay for Chantel's first lavish destination wedding in Jamaica. A wedding to a man she divorced less than a year later because he could not afford her lifestyle. Chantel gasped, looking around nervously as the church elders exchanged shocked glances. They knew about her first failed marriage, but they had no idea how it was funded. You stole my future to pay for her party. I continued, my voice steady, slicing through the heavy tension. And when I confronted you crying and begging for my tuition money back, do you remember what you told me? You told me God wanted me to learn humility. You told me my sister needed a beautiful wedding to secure a good husband, and that my education was a worthy sacrifice for the family's social standing. You protected her vanity by destroying my life. So do not stand there and preach to me about family protection. My father's face contorted with rage. He was not used to being challenged, especially not in front of his devoted deacons. He opened his mouth to shout another religious reprimand, but my mother Beatrice cut him off. She shoved her way past him, her eyes completely wild with desperation and fury. If she could not intimidate me into giving up the house, she would physically destroy the evidence. You wicked, selfish girl! Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking with an unhinged feral desperation. She lunged awkwardly across the wide expanse of the kitchen island, sending a tray of expensive catered hors d'oeuvres crashing to the floor. Her hands clawed frantically at the leather folder, determined to snatch the lease agreement and rip the physical deed to shreds right in front of everyone. I calmly stepped aside and slid the folder out of her frantic reach. Beatrice stumbled forward, her chest slamming hard against the cold marble counter. She scrambled to regain her balance, her perfectly styled hair falling messily into her face, completely stripping away her dignified persona. You can try to tear up the paperwork if you want. Beatrice, I stated, staring down at her with absolute indifference. I have digital copies, physical backups, and an entire legal team on retainer. Tearing up a piece of paper will not change the reality of your situation. I reached into the back pocket of the leather folder and pulled out a single bright yellow sheet of paper. I placed it gently on the counter right in front of my mother's grasping hands. It will not change the absolute fact that Darius is 3 full months behind on his rent, I announced, clearly making absolutely sure the entire room heard the final, highly devastating detail. And it certainly will not change the fact that the official eviction notice was filed at the local county courthouse at exactly 9 o'clock this very morning. The sheer finality of that statement hit the room like a physical shockwave, and for a brief second nobody breathed at all before Darius completely collapsed onto the ground. His knees hit the hard marble floor with a sickening thud. The sophisticated, confident real estate mogul vanished completely and was replaced by a pathetic, trembling man staring up at my father. He grabbed the fabric of the expensive suit trousers my father wore, with his hands shaking violently as he begged for salvation. Please, Pastor Thomas, Darius pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine as he cried loudly. You have to make her stop this right now. You are her father, so tell her to cancel the eviction today. It was just a small financial miscalculation and a tiny cash flow problem. I can fix it, I swear to you. Just make Nia give us a little more time to pay. I will pay her back every single cent I owe. Do not let her ruin us like this. Pastor Thomas looked down at the man he had praised all evening with sheer disgust. He violently yanked his suit leg out of the desperate grip, stepping back quickly. The deacons in the room were watching every single move, completely scandalized by the display of weakness and fraud unfolding right in front of their eyes. Chantel could not process what was happening at all. Her perfect reality had fractured, and she responded the only way she knew how to react. She threw an absolute tantrum. She stomped her designer heels against the floor, her face turning a deep mottled red. "My reputation is flawless, and I will not let a bitter woman like you destroy my perfect social standing today. You cannot do this to me, Nia," she screamed. "You cannot evict me tonight. Do you know who I am in this city? I am a prominent member of this community, and I host charity galas. My friends are in this very room right now. You are not going to throw my custom furniture out onto the street like I am some common criminal. I will not allow you to embarrass me in front of the church elders. I am the pride of this family." I watched my sister unravel, completely unfazed by her loud screaming and insults. "You embarrassed yourself, Chantel," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "You chose to live a fake lifestyle funded by predatory loans you could not afford to pay back. You chose to stand on that staircase and mock me for living within my means. I am simply enforcing a legally binding commercial contract that your husband willingly signed." Seeing her golden child in absolute distress activated the deeply ingrained defense mechanisms of my mother. Beatrice rushed forward, wrapping her arms protectively around the shoulders of her favorite daughter. She glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, her maternal instincts entirely focused on saving Chantel at my expense. "You are a monster." Nia Beatrice spat, her voice laced with venom. "If you proceed with this eviction, you are actively destroying the beautiful marriage of your sister. How can you live with yourself knowing you tore apart a holy union, recognized by God? Above, you have always been so incredibly selfish since you were a child. You see them struggling, and instead of showing grace, you use your money as a weapon against us." I tilted my head slightly, observing the ridiculous mental gymnastics my mother was currently employing to make me the villain of this story. "They brought this on themselves, Beatrice," I stated firmly. "We will fix it then," my mother declared, puffing out her chest with misplaced authority. "We do not need your toxic money anymore. Your father and I will pay off the debt ourselves. We will take out a second mortgage on our house tomorrow morning to save them. We will write you a check for every single dime he owes, and then you are going to transfer this deed over to Chantel immediately. We will wash our hands of your vindictive corporate games forever and ever." Pastor Thomas nodded vigorously in agreement, stepping up beside his wife. "That is exactly right," my father announced, trying to regain control of his deeply fractured congregation. "We protect our own people in this house. We have significant equity in our family home. We will secure a loan, clear this minor hurdle, and ensure Chantel and Darius keep their beautiful villa. And you, Nia, will be answering to the Lord for how you treated your own flesh and blood tonight." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen island as they all glared. I stared at my parents, taking in their righteous indignation and their absolute willingness to sacrifice their own financial security to bail out a man who had lied to them for years. Then I laughed loudly. It was not a joyful sound at all. It was a dark, chilling laugh that echoed through the high ceilings of the lavish villa, causing several guests to literally take a step back in fear. The sound carried so much weight that even Chantel stopped her hysterical sobbing to look at me in sheer terror. "You cannot take out a second mortgage, Mother," I said, a cold smile playing on my lips. Beatrice scoffed, crossing her arms defensively across her chest. "Watch us do it, Nia. Our credit is flawless, and we have owned our home for 20 years without missing a single payment." I reached back into my tote bag and pulled out a thick black financial ledger binding. I dropped it heavily onto the marble counter right next to the eviction notice. I slowly opened the cover, revealing pages of highlighted bank transfers, legal filings, and heavily redacted corporate account numbers for everyone to see clearly. Darius White called out, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch. "Did you happen to tell my parents exactly how you secured the massive initial deposit required to fake this wealthy lifestyle? Did you explain to the good pastor where you got the capital to lease a Maserati, buy designer suits, and pretend to be a top-tier real estate investor after losing your license to practice? Darius scrambled up from the floor, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a trapped animal looking for a way out. He looked at the front door, then toward the large sliding glass doors leading to the backyard patio area. Pure adrenaline and panic took over his entire body in that moment. He did not say a word to anyone. He just turned and bolted, making a desperate mad dash toward the back exit to escape the incoming wrath. He did not make it very far at all. Aunt Vivica had anticipated his exact move from the very beginning. She smoothly stepped directly into his path, blocking the exit with her body, and a heavy decorative bronze statue she had casually picked up from a side table. She leveled a fierce, unwavering glare at the terrified man. You are not going anywhere, little boy," Aunt Vivica commanded, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "You are going to stand right there and listen to every single word my niece has to say to you." Darius backed away from her, trembling violently, and bumped right into a group of angry church deacons who firmly crossed their arms, trapping him in the center of the room. There was no escape for him now. He was forced to face the absolute destruction of his fraudulent empire. I turned my attention back to my parents, whose faces had drained of all color entirely. They were finally beginning to understand that the nightmare was much deeper than a simple unpaid rent bill. Since Darius is suddenly too shy to explain his brilliant investment strategies, I will do it for him, I announced, opening a specific file in the massive ledger. When Darius came to my private equity firm through his anonymous shell corporation, he needed a massive amount of collateral to secure this highly predatory lease agreement. Since his credit was completely ruined, he had to provide an asset of significant value to guarantee the loan approval. Pastor Thomas stepped forward, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow as he listened to my words. "What asset, Nia, are you talking about right now?" I pulled a single sheet of paper from the ledger, holding it up so the overhead chandelier illuminated the thick black ink and the blue notary stamp at the very bottom. "He provided a property deed," I explained, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Darius gained access to your private safe inside your home. He took the official deed to your church parsonage home, the very house you have lived in for 20 years. He meticulously forged both of your signatures on a massive stack of legal documents to cross-collateralize your home. You do not own your house anymore." The sheer finality of that horrifying truth hit the massive kitchen like a physical shockwave. For a brief second, nobody breathed at all. Then the complete reality of their absolute financial ruin crashed down upon my parents. Pastor Thomas stumbled backward, his hand flying up to clutch tightly at his chest. His breathing became ragged, his eyes widening in disbelief as he stared at the forged legal documents. Beside him, Mother Beatrice let out a low, strangled gasp. Her knees buckled and she collapsed into one of the velvet dining chairs, her face turning gray. For decades, they had built their entire identity on the foundation of their beautiful parsonage home, their pristine credit scores, and their status within the Atlanta church community. In a matter of seconds, all of it had been wiped out by the man they had chosen to idolize over their daughter. "You lying, thieving parasite!" Beatrice shrieked, swinging her arms wildly as she tried to strike his chest. "You stole my house. You stole the roof over my head to fund your pathetic fake lifestyle. I welcomed you into my family and you robbed us blind. I will have you thrown in federal prison for the rest of your natural life." Darius cowered, shielding his face with his arms, as Aunt Vivica and two deacons had to step in to pull Beatrice back. But before anyone else could intervene, Chantel shoved her way into the center of the chaos. In a display of sheer mind-boggling delusion, she positioned herself directly in front of her husband, shielding the man who had just destroyed her parents' lives. "Leave him alone!" Chantel screamed at our mother, her voice shrill and completely devoid of any empathy. "He was just trying to provide me with the lifestyle I deserve. You have no right to attack him like this." Beatrice stared at her favorite daughter, absolutely dumbfounded. "He stole my house, Chantel. He forged our signatures and gave our home to the bank. We are going to be homeless because of your husband." Chantel tossed her hair over her shoulder, her expression hardening into a mask of pure entitlement. "Well, you should be happy to sacrifice your home for my happiness," she yelled back, her words echoing through the room and causing the remaining guests to gasp in shock. You and Dad have lived in that old house for 20 years. You have had your time. I am your daughter. I am the pride of this family. I am the one who hosts the galas and brings important people to your congregation. If you have to sacrifice your house so I can keep my beautiful villa and maintain my social standing, then you should consider it an absolute honor. You are my parents. It is your job to sacrifice everything for my joy. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Even Pastor Thomas looked at his golden child with a newfound expression of horror. He had spent 35 years spoiling her, elevating her above me, feeding her endless vanity, and demanding I sacrifice my own well-being to keep her comfortable. Now the monster he had meticulously created was standing right in front of him, casually telling him to accept homelessness so she could keep her leased chandeliers. Thomas turned away from Chantel. He looked at Darius, who was still trembling in the corner, and then he slowly turned his gaze toward me. The anger that had fueled him just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked realization that he had absolutely zero power left in this situation. He took a hesitant step toward me, his hands raised in a pleading gesture. Maya, he began, his pastoral voice trembling slightly as he tried to shift tactics. I know we have had our differences. I know things have been difficult between us in the past. But you just told us you sold your business for millions. You are the chief executive officer of a private equity firm. You have extreme wealth now. You have incredible resources. You can fix this, Maya, my father begged, the desperation bleeding heavily into his tone. You can call your bank tomorrow morning. You can pay off Darius's debts. You can clear the lien on our home and buy this villa for your sister. You have the power to save this entire family from utter destruction. You are rich now, Maya. You must fix this. We are your blood. We gave you life. You owe us this much. Please, Maya, you must use your blessings to deliver your family from this terrible storm. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life breaking me down, now standing before me demanding that I use the wealth I built, without his help, to save the people who actively tried to ruin me. I looked at Beatrice, who had stopped struggling against the deacons and was now staring at me with a sudden greedy spark of hope in her eyes. I looked at Chantel, who had crossed her arms, clearly expecting me to fold under the pressure of religious and familial guilt, just like I always had when I was younger. I slowly reached into the pocket of my silk dress. I pulled out my designer leather wallet. The room went dead silent again. The church elders leaned forward, waiting to see if the dutiful pastor's daughter would actually write the massive check required to bail out her abusers. I opened the wallet and bypassed the black credit cards. I reached into a small zippered compartment and carefully pulled out a single crushed, heavily wrinkled piece of paper. I unfolded it slowly, smoothing out the deep creases until the old, worn $50 bill was clearly visible to everyone watching. I held the faded green bill up between my fingers, letting the overhead light catch its ragged edges. I locked my eyes directly onto my father's face, making sure he had my undivided attention. When I was 21 years old, I stated, my voice echoing with a chilling absolute calm. My appendix ruptured in the middle of the night. I was in agonizing, blinding pain, curled up on the bathroom floor of your house. I begged you to take me to the emergency room. I begged you to pay my medical copay so I could get the immediate surgery I desperately needed to save my life. My father swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the floor. Beatrice looked away suddenly, unable to meet my gaze. Do you remember what you told me, Father? I asked, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to him. You looked down at me while I was bleeding and screaming in agony, and you flatly refused. You told me you absolutely could not spare a single dime for my medical bills because you needed the money for Chantel's premium VIP church gala tickets that upcoming weekend. You told me her networking opportunities were far more important than my emergency surgery. The church elders gasped aloud. Aunt Vivica shook her head in disgust, glaring at my parents. Then I continued, my voice never rising, never breaking, holding the room captive in my icy grip. You reached into your pocket, pulled out this exact $50 bill, and threw it directly at my face. You told me to walk to the bus stop in the freezing rain and take public transit to a free charity clinic across town. You told me to stop being a massive burden to the family finances. I kept this bill. I whispered, my voice dripping with lethal precision. I kept it for 11 years as a daily reminder of exactly what my life was worth to you. I looked at this bill every single time I worked a 90-hour week, every time I closed a deal, every time I built my empire from the ground up, without a single ounce of support from you. I held the old crushed $50 bill out in front of me. I let go of it. The paper fluttered slowly through the tense air, drifting down until it landed softly right on my father's expensive suit lapel. Here is your bailout. I watched as the crushed $50 bill slid off the luxurious fabric of my father's tailored suit and fell onto the polished marble floor. It rested there, a pathetic, wrinkled symbol of their historical cruelty. My father stared down at the crumpled money, his shoulders sagging. He had absolutely no power here. He had absolutely no leverage. The daughter he had once deemed entirely worthless was now the only person standing between him and absolute ruin, and she was walking away. I turned my back on his silent, pleading gaze, feeling absolutely no remorse for him at all. The time for begging had passed. Now it was solely time for the absolute inevitable consequences to completely arrive here today. Seeing my father completely broken and staring silently at the crumpled $50 bill on the floor finally triggered something deep inside Darius. The panicked, trembling man who had just been begging on his knees suddenly vanished. He realized with absolute certainty that Pastor Thomas was entirely powerless to save him. The church funds could not be mobilized to bail him out, and my mother's delusional threats held absolutely no weight against my legal authority. He was completely cornered. Like any desperate rat backed into a dark corner with no escape route, his immediate instinct was to bare his teeth and aggressively attack the biggest threat in the room. He pushed himself off the cold marble floor, his expensive tailored suit now wrinkled and heavily stained with nervous sweat. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, his features contorted into an ugly mask of pure malice. "You think you are so incredibly powerful right now?" Darius spat, his voice echoing harshly against the high ceilings of the lavish kitchen. "You think throwing your corporate money around makes you superior to us. But look at you. You are just a bitter, lonely, and deeply ugly spinster. You might have millions of dollars in your bank account, but you have absolutely nobody to share it with. No man will ever love a cold, calculating, heartless machine like you. You are doing all of this because you are insanely jealous of what we have built. You have spent your entire life watching Chantel get everything you ever wanted. You are furiously jealous of her beauty, her social standing in the Atlanta community, and most importantly, you are deeply jealous of our amazing love. You are actively trying to destroy my marriage tonight because you know deep down that you will die alone in that big empty mansion of yours." His desperate, vicious insults bounced off me like rain against a solid brick wall. I did not flinch, I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not show a single ounce of vulnerability. I just looked at him with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. He really thought his petty insults about my relationship status would shatter my confidence completely, underestimating the impenetrable armor I had built over the last decade. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him, closing the physical distance until I could see the frantic pulse beating wildly in his neck. "Speaking of love, Darius," I replied, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. "Let us talk about your incredible capacity for love. Let us talk about the highly secretive offshore bank accounts you have been quietly funneling the church building fund into for the last 14 months. The entire room went dead silent again, but this time the silence was heavy and suffocating. The church elders who had been watching the family drama unfold with shocked fascination suddenly stiffened their expressions, hardening into masks of pure outrage. The church building fund was a multi-million-dollar project fueled by the hard-earned donations of the entire Atlanta congregation. Pastor Thomas had trusted Darius to act as the primary financial consultant for the massive expansion project. My father's head snapped up from the floor, his eyes widening in pure horror as the terrifying realization of my words finally hit him. Darius swallowed hard, the last remaining drops of color rapidly draining from his face. "I do not know what you are talking about." Darius stammered, his sudden aggressive bravado evaporating instantly. That is a completely separate corporate account. You have absolutely no access to those private church financial records. I do not need direct access to your deeply flawed church records, I stated coldly. I run a massive private equity firm. I have an entire dedicated team of forensic accountants who trace dirty money and uncover hidden assets for a living. I gave a subtle nod across the room. Aunt Vivica smiled, a wicked, highly satisfied smile. She had been waiting for this exact moment all evening. She reached into her oversized designer tote bag and confidently pulled out a thick, heavy stack of printed emails, wire transfer receipts, and comprehensive offshore bank statements. She walked right through the crowd of stunned deacons and slammed the massive stack of documents down onto the marble kitchen island directly next to the eviction notice and the forged deed. Feel free to carefully review the accounting, Pastor. Thomas, Aunt Vivica announced, her voice ringing with triumphant authority. Your brilliant son-in-law has been systematically embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from your sacred church expansion project. And he has not been using that stolen money to fund his struggling real estate business either. I turned my attention back to Darius, who looked as if he might pass out right there on the floor. You have been using the congregation's hard-earned donations to fund a very expensive, highly secretive double life down in Miami. I revealed, making absolutely sure every single person in the room heard the absolute truth. You leased a luxury beachfront condominium under a fake corporate name. You bought a brand new sports car in cash, and you have been actively funding the lavish lifestyle of a 24-year-old fitness model you met on social media. I have the detailed receipts for the diamond necklaces, the luxury vacations to the Bahamas, and the incredibly expensive dinners you bought her using the exact money meant for the new community youth center. That is exactly where the church money went, Darius. You actively stole from the devout congregation to finance your secret mistress. Mother Beatrice gasped loudly, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically struck. The devastating reality that the man she had elevated above her own daughter was actually a common thief, actively stealing from her husband's church, was too much for her to bear. But Chantel's reaction was entirely different. Chantel let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream. She lunged forward desperately, grabbing the printed bank statements off the marble counter. She scanned the highlighted transactions, her eyes darting frantically over the luxurious Miami purchases and the frequent wire transfers bearing her husband's official signature. She shook her head violently, her perfect hair flying in every direction as her carefully constructed reality completely shattered into a million pieces. "This is a malicious lie!" Chantel shrieked, her voice tearing through the room. "Nia is faking these documents. She printed these out to frame you, Darius. Tell them she is lying right now. Tell them you would never betray me like this. You love me. We are the perfect couple. You would never steal from my father to spend money on another woman." Darius opened his mouth, but absolutely no words came out. He just stared at the damning evidence, his entire body trembling as the severe consequences of his actions finally crashed down upon him. He looked at Chantel, then at the furious church deacons, and finally at me, realizing he was entirely trapped with absolutely no way out. I did not waste my time arguing with my sister's deep delusion. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my settings and quickly paired my device with the expensive high-end Bluetooth speakers installed throughout the ceiling of the lavish villa. I selected an audio file from my secure evidence folder and pressed play. The crisp, unmistakable voice of Darius echoed loudly through the entire house, freezing everyone in their tracks. "Baby, I know you are tired of waiting around down there." Darius's recorded voice promised smoothly, his tone dripping with arrogant confidence. "Just give me 2 more months. I am going to completely drain the old man's construction accounts by the middle of November. He is an absolute fool, and he trusts me completely. Once the final transfer clears the offshore account, I am packing my bags and leaving Chantel right before the holidays. She is driving me completely crazy with her constant demands for expensive gifts. We will be sipping cocktails in Miami permanently, I promise you. Just hold on a little longer." The recording ended, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The congregation members who had filled the room with joyful celebration just an hour ago were now standing frozen in absolute disgust. The deep betrayal they felt was palpable, radiating through the air and choking the last bits of life out of the party. These were people who had generously donated their hard-earned salaries to build a sanctuary for their children. Knowing that their tremendous sacrifices had instead purchased diamond necklaces and luxury sports cars for a deceitful man's mistress was a reality too sickening to comprehend. The entire foundation of their faith in my father's leadership had been irrevocably fractured in front of their very eyes. Chantel's desperate cries echoed through the hollow space, completely ignored by the very people she had tried so hard to impress. Deacon Harrison, a man who had served on the church financial board for over 2 decades, finally broke away from the paralyzed crowd of guests. He was a towering figure in the Atlanta community, known for his strict adherence to moral integrity and his unwavering dedication to the congregation. His face was set in lines of absolute unyielding fury as he marched directly toward my father. The heavy silence in the room seemed to part for him like the Red Sea. He did not look at Darius, who was still cowering near the kitchen island, nor did he spare a single glance for Chantel, who was currently weeping loudly into her hands. Deacon Harrison kept his dark, piercing eyes locked entirely on Pastor Thomas. Thomas Deacon Harrison bellowed, dropping the respectful title of pastor completely. The omission of the holy title struck my father like a physical blow. He flinched, stepping backward as the furious church leader invaded his personal space. "You have stood at our sacred pulpit for 20 years, preaching about the absolute necessity of sacrifice and the holy virtue of tithing. You asked single mothers to give their last $10 to fund a youth center that you claimed would save our children from the streets. You demanded that our elderly members empty their meager retirement accounts to build a glorious sanctuary for the Lord. And all this time you handed the keys to the kingdom over to a common thief simply because he married your favorite daughter." My father opened his mouth to speak, holding up his hands in a desperate, placating gesture, but Deacon Harrison immediately cut him off. "I want the complete church financial ledgers handed over to the Board of Elders by tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp." Deacon Harrison demanded, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. "I want every single bank statement, every single wire transfer receipt, and every single offshore account detail that your son-in-law has been using to siphon our hard-earned money to fund his filthy lifestyle in Miami. You will surrender all administrative access to the church accounts immediately." Pastor Thomas frantically tried to deploy the charismatic pastoral charm that had successfully shielded him from accountability for his entire life. He smoothed down the lapels of his expensive tailored suit, forcing a deeply fake, sorrowful expression onto his sweating face. He lowered his voice into the soothing, rhythmic cadence he used to hypnotize the congregation every Sunday morning. "Brother Harrison, please," my father pleaded, stepping forward with his arms wide open, as if to embrace the furious man. "The devil is simply working hard tonight to divide our beautiful flock. We cannot let these malicious, unverified accusations tear apart our holy sanctuary. Darius has clearly strayed from the righteous path, and he has committed terrible sins against our family and against God. But I had absolutely no knowledge of his dark, secret transgressions. I am a victim of his wicked deception just as much as you are. We must pray on this matter together, as a united brotherhood of faith. We must handle this delicate family issue internally behind the closed doors of the church to protect the sacred reputation of our ministry." Deacon Harrison did not buy a single word of the pathetic, manipulative performance. He swatted my father's outstretched hands away with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Do not you dare invoke the name of the Lord to cover up your gross incompetence and staggering negligence." Deacon Harrison roared, his voice echoing loudly across the massive marble kitchen. "You enabled this man. You gave him unchecked power because you were utterly blinded by your own sickening vanity. You wanted a flashy, wealthy son-in-law to parade around Atlanta high society, and you willingly sacrificed the financial security of thousands of innocent, faithful people to get him." The remaining deacons and church elders stepped up behind Deacon Harrison, forming a solid, intimidating wall of opposition against my father. They murmured their loud agreement, nodding firmly as Harrison delivered the final devastating verdict. Effective immediately, you are completely stripped of your pastoral title and your leadership duties. Deacon Harrison announced, delivering the ultimate social execution right there in the middle of Chantel's ruined housewarming party. You are formally suspended from the ministry pending a full, exhaustive police investigation into these missing funds. You will not step foot on church property. You will not contact the congregation. We are calling the authorities to report the massive embezzlement tonight. Your reign of hypocrisy is officially over, Thomas. The reality of his complete public destruction hit my father like a freight train. He staggered backward, clutching his chest completely, unable to form a coherent sentence as his entire prestigious world burned to the ground. Seeing her husband publicly stripped of his immense power and her own elevated social status, evaporating into thin air, caused my mother Beatrice to completely lose her mind. The pristine, elegant facade of the perfect pastor's wife shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her eyes darted wildly around the lavish room, landing on the judgmental faces of the wealthy friends she had spent decades trying to impress. "Get out!" Beatrice shrieked, waving her arms frantically at the shocked guests. Her voice was shrill and completely unhinged. "Get out of my daughter's house right now! All of you are ungrateful, wicked people. We have spent 20 years spiritually guiding you, and the second a liar brings fake documents into this home, you turn your backs on us. Leave us alone. This party is absolutely over. Get out of here before I call the police and have you all arrested for trespassing." The guests did not need to be told twice. They were already rushing toward the front doors, eager to escape the suffocating toxicity of our family implosion. Women grabbed their expensive coats, and men quickly ushered their wives out into the cool Atlanta night, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the impending police investigation. As the crowd rapidly thinned out, Beatrice turned her wild, furious gaze entirely toward me. I was the source of her destruction. I was the catalyst who had bravely exposed the deep rot hiding beneath her perfect manicured life. "You evil, vindictive demon!" Beatrice screamed, storming across the marble floor directly toward where I stood next to Aunt Vivica. "You came here tonight specifically to destroy this blessed family. You could not handle the fact that Chantel is more beautiful, more loved, and more successful than you will ever be. You are a toxic, jealous agent of Satan sent here to ruin our holy lives. You planted those fake offshore bank statements. You tricked Darius into signing that predatory lease. You manipulated everyone here because you have a black, empty heart." Beatrice was breathing heavily, spittle flying from her lips as she raged. She raised her hands, curling her fingers into tight claws, and launched herself aggressively at my chest. She tried to physically push me backward toward the heavy wooden front doors, desperately wanting to physically eject me from the premises, to somehow regain a pathetic shred of her lost control. "Get out of this house!" Beatrice ordered, her voice tearing at the seams as she shoved her hands against my silk dress. "Go back to your miserable, lonely life, and never show your ugly face to us again. You are not my daughter. You are a curse. Leave this property immediately and never return." I did not stumble. I did not move a single inch backward. As she drew her hand back to aggressively shove me a second time, I reached out with lightning speed. I easily caught her wrist in midair. My grip was tight, firm, and completely immovable. Beatrice, her eyes widening as she realized I was physically and emotionally far stronger than she could ever comprehend. She tried to yank her arm away, but I held her firmly in place, forcing her to look directly into my cold, unwavering eyes. "I am not leaving, Beatrice," I stated, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm that echoed clearly through the rapidly emptying living room. I released her wrist, letting her arm drop limply to her side. She stared at me, trembling with a mixture of immense fear and burning hatred. I slowly reached back into my leather folder, pulling out the final piece of devastating legal paperwork I had prepared for this exact, highly anticipated moment. "I am not leaving, because as of 8 o'clock this morning, my firm also bought the defaulted debt on your church parsonage home," I revealed, delivering the ultimate crushing blow. "You are standing in my property right now, and you no longer have a house of your own to return to. The bank sold me your absolute deed this very morning. You are officially homeless, and your fake, glamorous kingdom has finally fallen apart completely. My patience with your abuse is permanently over today." The sheer finality of that statement hit the room like a physical shockwave. The devastating reality of my absolute ownership settled over the lavish kitchen like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Mother Beatrice stumbled backward, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Her beloved church parsonage, her supreme symbol of status, was gone. But while Beatrice was completely paralyzed by the profound loss of her family home, Chantal was experiencing a very different kind of nightmare. The golden child slowly turned her head, looking around the massive, luxurious living room of the modern villa she had proudly claimed as her own just an hour ago. The extravagant housewarming party had transformed into a spectacular, humiliating disaster. The few remaining guests who had not yet fled to their luxury cars were not looking at Chantal with envy or admiration anymore. They were holding up their smartphones. The bright flashlights from their cameras illuminated the shattered champagne glass on the marble floor and the defeated posture of Pastor Thomas. They were recording every single second of our family's absolute destruction. The prominent deacons, the wealthy socialites, the people Chantal had spent years desperately trying to impress, were now documenting her spectacular downfall for the entire Atlanta church community to see and share. Then the final blow to her carefully crafted illusion arrived from the kitchen. The head caterer, a stern woman in a crisp black suit, walked directly past Darius. She did not offer a polite smile or a deferential nod. She simply signaled her staff. In complete silence, the catering team began rapidly packing up the silver chafing dishes, taking away the expensive hot hors d'oeuvres, and boxing up the towering multi-tiered housewarming cake. "Excuse me!" Chantal shrieked, her voice cracking, as she watched a waiter carry away a heavy silver tray of untouched premium caviar. "What are you doing? This party is not over yet. You cannot take the food away. We paid for a full evening of premium service. You need to leave that food right here on this table." The head caterer stopped and looked at my sister with pure, unfiltered pity. "I am very sorry," the caterer stated, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "But the credit card your husband provided for the remaining balance of the catering fee just declined. We tried running it 3 separate times. The account has been completely frozen by the bank due to insufficient funds. We are packing up our equipment and leaving this property immediately." Chantal gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically shot. The absolute embarrassment of having her food repossessed in front of her high society friends was the final nail in the coffin of her delusional pride. Her perfect, flawless life was completely gone. She had absolutely no money, no rented villa, and absolutely no social standing left to her name. The fake empire was completely dead. The sudden realization completely broke her spirit. The arrogant, condescending woman who had stood on the marble staircase and mocked my modest beige dress just an hour ago completely vanished. In her place was a frantic, terrified shell of a person. Chantal looked at her husband, who was still trapped by the angry church elders. She looked at her parents, who were entirely powerless to save their own home, let alone hers. Finally, her wild, panicked eyes locked directly onto me. I was the only person in the room with actual power, actual wealth, and the absolute legal authority to decide her fate. Chantal practically sprinted across the polished marble floor toward me. Before I could even take a step back, she dropped heavily onto her knees right in front of me. The expensive emerald green silk of her designer gown pooled around her on the floor, soaking up the spilled champagne. She reached out with her manicured hands and desperately grabbed the hem of my simple beige dress. Her perfectly applied makeup was completely ruined, dark streaks of black mascara running down her cheeks as she began to sob uncontrollably. "Nia, please," Chantal begged, her voice high-pitched and entirely frantic. "Please do not do this to me. You cannot throw me out of this house. You cannot evict me in front of all these people tonight. I will lose absolutely everything. My friends will laugh at me. The entire church community will gossip about my massive failure. Please let me stay in the villa. You have millions of dollars in your accounts. You own a massive private equity firm. You do not even need this house. Just let me keep it." I stared down at her, making absolutely no move to pull my dress away from her desperate grip. I just watched her thoroughly humiliate herself in front of everyone. "I will be a good sister from now on." Chantal cried, the words tumbling out of her mouth in a rapid, pathetic stream. I promise you, Nia, I will treat you with absolute respect. I will never say another mean thing to you ever again. We can be best friends. Just let me keep the house. It is all his fault. It is not mine. She aggressively pointed a shaking finger directly at Darius, actively throwing her husband to the wolves to save her own skin. Darius lied to me, Chantel screamed, fully shifting the blame away from herself. He manipulated me from the start. He is a total fraud and a criminal. And Mom and Dad encouraged him. They always told me I deserved the very best, and they pushed me to marry a wealthy man to maintain their precious church image. They are the ones who made me this way. It is their fault entirely. I am just an innocent victim of their toxic expectations. Please, Nia. You are the only family I have left who can actually protect me. Have a little mercy on your big sister. Her pathetic attempt to play the innocent victim was absolutely nauseating. She was perfectly willing to completely destroy her husband and her parents if it meant she could keep her lavish rented lifestyle. I looked down at her tear-stained face, feeling absolutely zero sympathy for the woman kneeling at my feet. Mercy. I repeated, my voice dropping to a cold, dangerous pitch. You want to talk to me about sisterly mercy, Chantel? Let us take a quick trip down memory lane. I leaned down slightly, forcing her to look directly into my unwavering eyes. Do you remember exactly 7 years ago when I lost my very first corporate job because the startup company went bankrupt? I asked, the raw history of her cruelty sharpening every single word. I had absolutely zero savings. I was terrified, completely broke, and facing immediate eviction from my tiny studio apartment. I came to your luxury townhouse crying and begging you to let me sleep on your living room couch for just one single week until I could secure a new job and find a cheap room to rent. Do you remember what you told me that night? Chantel froze entirely, her sobbing halting abruptly as the heavy memory clearly hit her. She swallowed hard, unable to formulate a single excuse. You looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. I reminded her, ensuring my voice carried to the remaining guests, who were eagerly recording the confrontation. You told me that your purebred designer dog needed his own dedicated bedroom because he had severe anxiety. You told me that having a broke, unemployed sister sleeping on your expensive furniture would completely ruin your aesthetic. You locked your heavy front door and left me standing on the sidewalk in the pouring, freezing rain. I slept in the back seat of my freezing car for 10 straight days, eating cheap canned soup and washing my face in public gas station bathrooms before my job interviews. I reached down and firmly pried her desperate manicured fingers off the hem of my silk dress. I stepped back quickly, severing the physical connection completely. You did not show me a single ounce of mercy when I had absolutely nothing to my name. I stated, my tone radiating pure, unforgiving ice. You prioritized a small dog over the basic safety and survival of your own flesh and blood. So do not kneel on my marble floor and beg for a sisterly bond that you actively destroyed years ago. You are not keeping this house, Chantel. My luxury villa does not accept strays. The sheer brutality of my ultimate rejection hit Chantel like a physical strike to the chest. She slumped forward onto the floor, burying her face in her hands, completely shattered by the absolute certainty that her lavish fake life was entirely over. She had nothing left to leverage. But across the room, the dynamic was shifting rapidly and dangerously. Darius had been watching the entire exchange while deeply cornered by the furious church deacons. The devastating reality of his dire situation was finally penetrating his sheer panic. His offshore accounts were fully exposed. His embezzlement of the church building fund was public knowledge. His massive real estate fraud was heavily documented in the leather folders sitting right on the kitchen island. He was not just facing financial bankruptcy and a messy divorce. He was facing a massive federal indictment. I was going to spend the next decade in a high-security prison, and the only person holding the physical evidence was me. Pure, unadulterated desperation completely took over his frantic brain. Darius realized that if he could just destroy the physical financial ledger, if he could just grab my smartphone and smash the digital audio recordings, he might have a tiny chance to deny the heavy allegations. He might have a brief window to flee the state before the police arrived. With a sudden primal roar of sheer panic, Darius violently shoved his way through the solid wall of elderly church deacons. He lunged across the wide expanse of the marble kitchen, his eyes wide and fully unhinged, locking directly onto me. He reached out aggressively, his large hands aiming straight for my neck and the leather tote bag resting beside me on the counter. I did not scream. I did not flinch. I did not even take a single step backward. Before Darius could even close the physical distance, the heavy solid oak front doors of the villa were violently thrown wide open. Two massive, heavily armed private security guards wearing tactical black suits burst into the living room. I had hired them specifically for this evening, keeping them stationed discreetly on the front porch, with strict orders to monitor the situation through the open windows. They moved with terrifying professional speed. The first guard tackled Darius hard around his waist, stopping his aggressive lunge entirely in its tracks. The second guard grabbed Darius by his broad shoulders, lifting him completely off his feet and slamming him violently face first down onto the hard marble floor. The sickening thud of the impact echoed sharply. "Do not move a single muscle," the lead security guard commanded, pressing his heavy knee aggressively into the center of Darius's back, pinning the fraudster completely to the ground. Darius thrashed and gasped for air, his pristine tailored suit now scuffed and pressed against the cold marble floor. His sudden violent outburst had completely extinguished whatever tiny shred of sympathy the remaining church members might have held for him. The deacons stepped back in unison, their faces twisted in absolute disgust as they watched the so-called real estate mogul writhing like a captured animal. Before Darius could even manage to shout a cohesive demand to be released, the distinct, piercing wail of police sirens pierced the quiet atmosphere of the exclusive Buckhead neighborhood. The sound rapidly grew louder, echoing off the towering mansions and manicured lawns until it settled directly outside the massive front doors of the villa. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the grand windows, casting harsh shadows across the lavish living room. Chantel let out a blood-curdling shriek, scrambling backward on her hands and knees away from her pinned husband. My mother, Beatrice, clutched her chest, her breathing turning shallow as sheer panic washed over her face. My father, Pastor Thomas, stood entirely frozen, his eyes darting frantically toward the entrance. Deacon Harrison stepped forward, his posture rigid, and his voice booming with righteous anger. "I contacted the authorities. The absolute second your offshore church accounts were exposed," Deacon Harrison announced, glaring down at Darius. "We do not tolerate thieves in our sanctuary, and we certainly do not let them slip away in the middle of the night. You will answer to the law for every single dime you stole from our community." Heavy boots pounded against the front steps. Four uniformed Atlanta police officers marched through the open double doors, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts as they assessed the highly chaotic scene. They immediately spotted my security guards restraining Darius on the floor. I gave my head of security a swift, subtle nod. The guards stepped back, keeping a close perimeter, allowing the police officers to take total control of the suspect. Two officers grabbed Darius by his arms and hauled him roughly to his feet. They slammed him against the edge of the marble kitchen island, pulling his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs, snapping shut, echoed loudly through the room, officially sealing the spectacular downfall of my sister's fraudulent husband. The reality of his imminent arrest completely broke whatever remained of Darius's sanity. Realizing that the entire church administration had turned against him and that my father possessed no power to stop the police, Darius resorted to ultimate cowardice. He twisted his neck, his eyes wild and desperate, looking directly at Pastor Thomas. "Tell them the truth!" Thomas Darius screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as the officers tightened his restraints. "Tell them you knew all about the offshore transfers. He authorized the payments, officers. He is the head pastor of the church. I could not move a single dollar without his direct approval. We were working on a joint investment strategy to multiply the congregation's money. He took a massive cut of the funds to pay off his own personal gambling debts. You have to arrest him too. Do not let him lie to you. He is just as guilty as I am." The accusation hit my father like a physical blow. The absolute betrayal from his favored son-in-law was the final straw. Pastor Thomas lost every last ounce of his polished religious composure. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson, veins bulging prominently against his neck. "You lying, deceitful parasite," Pastor Thomas roared, lunging forward with his fists tightly clenched. He looked ready to physically assault the handcuffed man right in front of the police. "I never authorized a single transaction. You manipulated the accounting software and forged my electronic signature. You preyed on my trust and destroyed my entire ministry. You are going to burn in hell for this, Darius. You are going to rot in a federal cell for the rest of your miserable life." Darius spat back, his face twisted in a vicious sneer. "You are a complete fraud, Thomas. You only cared about my money because it made you look good to your wealthy friends. You sold your own soul for a leased Maserati and a fake mansion." The two men aggressively cursed at each other, exchanging vile insults and shattering the final illusion of their holy, blessed family dynamic. The police officers quickly intervened forcefully, shoving Pastor Thomas back to create a safe distance. The lead officer warned my father to step down or face immediate arrest for obstruction. Thomas stumbled backward, breathing heavily, completely humiliated, as the remaining deacons watched their former spiritual leader behave like a common street brawler. Witnessing her husband being publicly humiliated and her golden son-in-law being dragged away in handcuffs caused my mother to completely snap. Beatrice marched right up to the lead police officer, her eyes wide with unhinged delusion. She pointed an aggressive finger directly at me, determined to use her rapidly fading social status to regain control of the room. "Officer, you need to arrest this woman immediately," Beatrice ordered, her voice shrill and commanding. "She is violently trespassing on my daughter's private property. She brought these armed thugs into our house without our permission. She is actively harassing my family and causing a severe emotional disturbance. I demand that you place her in handcuffs and remove her from these premises right now. She is a dangerous, vindictive stalker." The lead officer looked at Beatrice with a mixture of profound annoyance and utter exhaustion. He turned his attention to me, noting my calm demeanor and the expensive silk dress that clearly indicated I was not a random intruder. "Ma'am," the officer said, addressing me politely, "can you please explain your presence here tonight?" I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. I simply picked up the heavy leather folder from the marble counter and handed it directly to the lead officer. "I suggest you review the first page of that legal packet, officer," I replied smoothly. "My name is Nia. I am the chief executive officer of the private equity firm that holds the absolute legal deed to this property. That man in handcuffs signed a rent-to-own lease agreement, and he is currently 3 months delinquent on his payments. The official eviction notice was filed at the county courthouse this morning. I am the sole rightful owner of this estate. My mother is the one who is currently trespassing." The officer reviewed the documents carefully, his eyes scanning the authentic notary stamps and the clear transfer of ownership. He handed the folder back to me, his demeanor shifting to one of absolute professional respect. He completely ignored Beatrice, acting as if her hysterical demands were nothing but background noise. "I apologize for the confusion, ma'am," the officer stated, addressing me directly. "Since you are the verified property owner, we need to ask how you want to proceed. This suspect attempted to physically assault you, and he caused significant damage to your property when he shattered that glass on your marble floor. Would you like to press additional criminal charges against him for attempted assault and property destruction tonight?" Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, utterly horrified that the police were taking my side and treating me with the utmost authority. I looked at Darius, who was now weeping softly, completely defeated by the weight of his impending incarceration. I considered adding assault charges to his lengthy list of crimes, but I realized it was entirely unnecessary. The federal embezzlement charges brought by the church deacons would easily secure him a decade behind bars. Adding a petty property damage charge would only tie me to his messy legal proceedings, and my ultimate goal was to erase him from my life entirely. "The federal fraud charges will be more than enough to handle him," I replied coldly. "Just remove him from my property immediately. I want the air in this house cleared of his presence." The officers nodded. They grabbed Darius by the arms and began dragging him forcefully toward the grand double doors. Darius did not fight back. He dragged his feet, his head hanging low, weeping loudly, as the flashing police lights illuminated his spectacular public ruin. The heavy front doors slammed shut behind him, leaving a hollow, echoing silence in the massive living room. Chantel had watched the entire arrest from the floor, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her absolute downfall. Her wealthy husband was gone. Her flawless social standing was permanently eradicated. But as the reality of her extreme poverty finally sank into her brain, her survival instincts kicked in. She scrambled up from the spilled champagne, her designer emerald gown completely ruined. She realized she was about to be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing. Chantel darted frantically toward the dining room, grabbing a large, expensive designer duffel bag that had been left near the coat check. She rushed toward the lavish dining table and began aggressively shoving heavy, solid silver serving trays and expensive crystal decanters into the bag. She frantically grabbed a small, highly valuable abstract painting off the wall, desperately trying to hoard as many high-priced items as she could carry before the inevitable eviction took place. "I need to sell these," Chantel muttered frantically, her hands shaking as she shoved a silver candelabra into the bag. "I need cash for a luxury hotel tonight. I am not sleeping in a cheap motel. These are my wedding gifts. I deserve to take them with me." I walked slowly across the room, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. I stopped right behind her, my presence casting a heavy, chilling shadow over her frantic packing. "Leave it!" I commanded, my voice slicing through the room with absolute, unyielding authority. Chantel froze, her hands gripping a silver serving spoon. She turned to look at me, her eyes wide with desperate defiance. "These are mine, Nia," she cried out. "You cannot take my personal belongings. You already took my house. Let me just take a few things so I can survive the week. You are a multimillionaire. You do not need my silver plates." I reached out and firmly snatched the expensive designer duffel bag right out of her trembling hands. I unceremoniously dumped the heavy silver trays and the crystal decanters back onto the dining table. The loud clattering sound made her flinch violently. "Read the fine print of your husband's commercial lease agreement, Chantel." "Chantel," I stated, staring her down with eyes devoid of any sisterly mercy whatsoever. "When a tenant defaults on a massive high-interest commercial loan, absolutely everything left inside the property is immediately seized by the landlord as collateral against the unpaid debt. Every single piece of custom furniture, every crystal chandelier, every silver spoon, and every piece of expensive art in this entire villa legally belongs to my private equity firm as of this morning. You do not own a single item in this house anymore." Chantel backed away from the table, her breath hitching in her throat, as the devastating reality crushed her final glimmer of hope. "You leave tonight with the exact clothes on your back," I finalized, sealing her ultimate fate with absolute ruthless precision and ensuring my total sweeping victory. Chantel stared at me, her hands trembling as she slowly released her grip on the expensive designer duffel bag. The heavy canvas dropped to the polished marble floor with a loud, resounding thud. The stolen silver serving trays and crystal decanters inside clattered sharply against each other, the sound echoing through the sudden, suffocating emptiness of the massive living room. Outside the large front windows, the flashing red and blue police lights began to fade as the patrol cars drove away, carrying Darius to a federal holding cell. The chaotic wail of the sirens disappeared into the quiet Atlanta night, leaving behind a profound and absolute silence. The extravagant housewarming party was completely over. The wealthy church deacons had fled. The catering staff had vanished. The hired musicians had packed their instruments and escaped out the back service doors. The lavish $2 million villa, previously filled with arrogant laughter and fake praise, now resembled an abandoned battlefield. Plates of half-eaten gourmet food sat forgotten on the glass coffee tables. Champagne from the glass Darius had shattered earlier was now drying into a sticky permanent stain on the pristine floor. Only 5 people remained inside the grand estate. Aunt Vivica stood comfortably by the sweeping staircase, her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with absolute satisfaction. Chantel remained frozen near the dining table, utterly defeated and stripped of her golden child status. My parents, Pastor Thomas and Mother Beatrice, stood near the kitchen island. They looked completely broken. Their shoulders slumped as the devastating reality of their situation fully settled into their minds. They had no money in their bank accounts. They had no prestigious church to lead tomorrow morning. They had no parsonage home to return to tonight. Everything they had built their arrogant identities upon had been completely destroyed in a single evening. My father looked around the empty, cavernous room. He looked at Chantel, who was weeping softly, unable to offer him a single ounce of comfort or financial salvation. Then he turned his gaze toward me. I watched his demeanor shift entirely. The furious, commanding church leader, who had threatened me with holy judgment just an hour ago, completely vanished. In his place stood a desperate, aging man who realized his discarded daughter was his only remaining lifeline. Thomas took a slow, hesitant step toward me. Tears began to well up in his eyes, spilling over his cheeks in a display of raw emotion I had never witnessed before. He raised his hands, palms open, attempting to project a posture of pure, unconditional fatherly love. "Nia, my sweet girl," Thomas began, his voice shaking with heavy manufactured sorrow. "Please forgive an old man for his foolish pride. I was so angry earlier because I was terrified of losing my family, but I see everything clearly now. You have to believe me. You were always my secret favorite daughter." I did not move. I just stared at him, letting him weave his pathetic web of lies. "It is the absolute truth," Thomas insisted, taking another step closer, tears streaming freely down his face now. "I saw your brilliant mind when you were just a little girl. I knew you were destined for incredible corporate success. I was so tough on you because I needed to prepare you for the harsh, unforgiving realities of the business world. I knew Chantel was fragile and needed coddling, but you were strong. I pushed you away so you would learn to fight for yourself. My harshness was just tough love, Nia. I made you into the brilliant chief executive officer you are today." Mother Beatrice eagerly jumped onto the emotional bandwagon, sensing the exact strategy her husband was employing. She wiped her own tears, nodding vigorously as she approached my side. "Your father is completely right, Nia," Beatrice cried, her voice dripping with fake, desperate affection. "We pushed you toward greatness. Every time we told you no, we were teaching you resilience. We are so incredibly proud of the wealthy, powerful woman you have become. You are the true savior of this family. We need you to forgive our clumsy parenting and embrace us. We are your blood, and family must always stick together through the darkest storms. We love you so much." They looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, fully expecting their sudden outpouring of parental affection to melt my heart. They truly believed that after 32 years of emotional neglect, a few fake tears and empty apologies would make me hand over my hard-earned millions to bail them out of their self-inflicted ruin. I looked at my father's weeping face. I looked at my mother's desperate, pleading hands. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no sadness, no longing for their approval, and certainly no desire to save them. The little girl who used to beg for their love was completely dead, replaced entirely by a calculating, successful businesswoman who recognized a terrible liability when she saw one. I did not embrace them. I took a deliberate step back, putting a cold physical distance between us. Your tough love did not make me a multimillionaire, Thomas. I stated, my voice completely devoid of any emotional warmth. My relentless work ethic, my severe sleep deprivation, and my absolute refusal to end up like the people in this room made me successful. You do not get to claim credit for the empire I built while you were actively trying to tear me down. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a sleek, modern electronic tablet. I tapped the screen, bringing up a detailed, heavily researched financial spreadsheet. I had prepared this specific document months ago, waiting for the perfect moment to present them with the absolute, undeniable truth of their financial abuse. "Let us drop the fake emotional manipulation and speak the only language you actually understand," I said, holding the tablet up so they could clearly see the columns of numbers. "Let us talk about pure, unadulterated financial logic. I am a private equity executive. I evaluate assets and liabilities for a living. And when I evaluate this family, I see a staggering history of negative returns." Thomas and Beatrice stopped crying, their faces going blank as they stared at the bright screen. "When I was 19 years old, you stole my college savings account, To pay for Chantel's first failed wedding, I read from the top line of the spreadsheet. That was $45,000 in stolen capital. When I was 21, you refused to pay my emergency medical copay of $2,000, forcing me to take on high-interest medical debt while you bought VIP church gala tickets. When I was 24 and starting my first junior corporate job, you pressured me into giving you a mandatory monthly tithe of $500, claiming God would curse my career if I did not pay you directly. You collected those payments for 3 straight years, that is $18,000. I scrolled down the document listing every single time they had financially exploited me to fund their comfortable lifestyle and Chantel's endless vanity. When you add up all the stolen college funds, the refused medical payments, the forced church tithes, and the various emergency loans you demanded from me over the last decade, the principal amount you stole equals exactly $89,400, I stated firmly. Chantel gasped from the dining room, realizing the sheer magnitude of the money diverted to her. But we are not just talking about the principal amount. I continued, my eyes locking onto my father. I am an investor. I understand the time value of money. If I had been allowed to keep my own money and invest it in a standard index fund over the last 13 years, the compound interest would have grown exponentially. Calculating a conservative 8% annual market return, the capital you stole from me would currently be worth exactly $214,622. I turned off the tablet screen and dropped it back into my tote bag. You did not teach me resilience, I said, delivering the cold, hard facts. You actively robbed me of my foundational wealth to fund a fake, glamorous lifestyle for a daughter who could not even afford her own catering bill tonight. I did not become a multimillionaire by making bad investments. And looking at the three of you right now, you are the absolute worst, most toxic liabilities I have ever encountered in my entire life. I am permanently divesting from this family tonight. The cold, calculated breakdown of their abuse completely shattered their emotional manipulation strategy. My father's shoulders slumped forward and he covered his face with his hands, realizing he could not outsmart me. But my mother Beatrice was not ready to surrender. Realizing that her fake tears and sweet words had failed completely, she immediately reverted to her true vicious nature. Her face turned red with explosive anger, and she pointed a shaking finger at me. "You think you are so smart with your corporate numbers?" Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing violently. "You think you can just throw your own parents out onto the street and walk away without any consequences? You are a cruel, heartless monster, Nia. If you kick us out of this house tonight, I swear to God I will go directly to the local media tomorrow morning." Beatrice stepped aggressively forward, trying to use her final desperate threat to intimidate me. "I will call every single news station in Atlanta," Beatrice threatened loudly. "I will give exclusive interviews, telling the entire world that the highly successful private equity chief executive officer, Nia, is actually a ruthless, evil corporate monster who threw her elderly parents and her pregnant sister out onto the cold street. I will destroy your professional reputation. Your wealthy corporate clients will drop you instantly when they find out how viciously you treat your own flesh and blood. You will be a complete pariah in the business world." Aunt Vivica let out a sharp, amused laugh from the stairs, clearly enjoying the sheer delusion of my mother's threats. I simply stood my ground. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not show a single ounce of fear. I looked at Beatrice, letting a slow, victorious smile spread across my face. "You are a little too late for that, Beatrice," I replied, my voice radiating absolute, unshakable confidence. "I already sent a comprehensive press release to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution at 6 o'clock this evening. I framed the entire situation as a massive corporate anti-fraud initiative led by my private equity firm. The story details how my company successfully uncovered a multi-million-dollar real estate embezzlement ring operated by a disgraced local broker. It highlights my firm's commitment to protecting the community from predatory financial scams. The financial journalists are already drafting their morning headlines, praising my swift, decisive action to stop a criminal enterprise. They know Darius stole church funds, and they know you two enabled his massive crimes. If you go to the media and try to spin a sob story, reporters will just ask why you willingly participated in a major federal embezzlement scheme. Your threat is entirely useless. The absolute reality of my total ownership finally crushed whatever remaining defiance my family held. I slowly raised my left arm, pulling back the sleeve of my beige silk dress to reveal the heavy gold face of my luxury watch. The steady ticking of the timepiece seemed to echo through the massive, silent living room. I looked directly at my father, then at my mother, and finally at my weeping sister. "You have exactly 10 minutes to completely vacate my property," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy air with absolute unyielding authority. "After those 10 minutes expire, I will have the security guards drag you out of here and arrest you for criminal trespassing." The immediate panic that erupted was a spectacular sight to behold. For my entire life, I had watched Pastor Thomas and Mother Beatrice glide through the wealthy Atlanta church community with an air of untouchable, arrogant grace. They had meticulously cultivated an image of flawless high society perfection. But in the face of sudden absolute poverty and the imminent threat of being physically thrown onto the street by armed security guards, that entire carefully crafted illusion shattered into a million pathetic pieces. My father, the supposedly dignified spiritual leader, frantically scrambled across the marble floor. He pushed his way past a tipped-over catering tray, desperately searching for his expensive cashmere overcoat. He bumped directly into Beatrice, who was wildly grabbing at her designer purse and frantically shoving a handful of loose church offering envelopes into her pockets. They were acting like terrified scavengers fleeing a sinking ship. The grand, dignified matriarch of the congregation was reduced to shoving her own husband out of the way just to grab a forgotten silk scarf from the velvet sofa. Chantel was in an even worse state. She scrambled around the kitchen island, her ruined emerald gown dragging heavily across the floor. She was aggressively tearing through the kitchen drawers, desperately looking for anything small and valuable she could hide in her pockets. She spotted a single expensive phone charger plugged into the wall near the marble countertops. In a display of sheer feral desperation, Chantel lunged for it. But Beatrice had seen it too. My mother actually slapped Chantel's hand away, snatching the white charging cable for herself. "I need this to call a taxi," Beatrice snapped aggressively, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of maternal affection. "You can borrow a phone from someone else," Chantel shrieked in absolute frustration. She grabbed her own hair, pulling at the expensive extensions, as the devastating reality of her completely bankrupt future truly began to sink into her mind. She had absolutely no money, no husband to bail her out, and no beautiful villa to hide her massive insecurities behind. She was leaving this multi-million-dollar property with nothing but the stained clothes on her back and a severely damaged public reputation. I stood perfectly still near the center of the massive room, watching them tear each other apart over a cheap phone charger. The absolute poetic justice of the moment washed over me. These were the exact same people who had arrogantly told me I was completely worthless. They had spent decades building themselves up by constantly tearing me down. Now they were furiously fighting each other just to salvage a tiny scrap of their ruined lives. 5 minutes remaining, I called out loudly. The security guards standing near the front entrance shifted their weight, crossing their arms aggressively as they prepared to physically enforce my strict deadline. Aunt Vivica casually strolled over to the grand double doors, positioning herself perfectly to watch the spectacular exit. She took a slow, highly satisfied sip from her crystal glass of bourbon. She had remained entirely silent during their frantic scramble, simply enjoying the glorious, chaotic show. But as Beatrice hastily marched toward the front door, clutching her purse and the stolen phone charger tightly to her chest, Aunt Vivica finally spoke up. Her voice was dripping with sharp, vindictive amusement. "Leaving so soon, Aunt Vivica asked, flashing a brilliantly mocking smile. "I thought you said this lavish housewarming party was going to be the absolute social event of the entire season." It certainly turned out to be an incredibly memorable night for the church elders. Beatrice stopped abruptly, her face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple. She glared at her sister with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You set this up, Vivica," Beatrice hissed viciously. You knew exactly what she was planning to do to us tonight, and you just stood there and watched my entire life fall apart. You have always been jealous of my success and my beautiful family. Aunt Vivica threw her head back and let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I did not set up a single thing, Bea, Aunt Vivica replied smoothly, stepping directly into my mother's path. Your own toxic greed and your blinding arrogance destroyed your life. You chose to value superficial wealth over your own flesh and blood. You spent the last 30 years looking down your nose at me because I was a single working woman who refused to depend on a man. You called me a pathetic spinster to anyone who would listen. You bragged endlessly about how your perfect husband and your golden child made you superior to me in every single way. Aunt Vivica took a slow step closer, her eyes flashing with triumphant power. Well, take a really good look around you right now, Bea. Your perfect husband is a disgraced, unemployed fraud. Your golden child is a completely broke, soon-to-be divorced squatter. And the daughter you threw away, like absolute garbage, just bought the very ground you are currently standing on. She took another sip of her bourbon, gesturing grandly around the massive, luxurious living room. It looks like my brilliant spinster niece and I are the only ones sleeping in expensive silk sheets tonight, Aunt Vivica declared with absolute ruthless finality. You better hurry outside, Bea. It is getting quite cold and you do not have a home to go back to anymore. Beatrice opened her mouth to scream another vile insult, but the lead security guard immediately stepped forward, placing a firm, intimidating hand on the heavy brass handle of the front door. Time is completely up, the guard announced in a deep, booming voice. Everyone needs to exit the property immediately. Pastor Thomas grabbed Beatrice by her arm, forcefully pulling her toward the exit. He knew they had absolutely no power left to fight. They were entirely defeated, stripped of their wealth, their home, and their social standing. Thomas kept his head hung low in utter shame as he walked past me, completely unable to meet my cold, unwavering gaze. He stepped out onto the front porch, pulling a weeping Beatrice along with him into the cool, dark Atlanta night air. Chantel was the very last person to leave the grand villa. She dragged her feet across the polished marble floor, her ruined emerald gown trailing sadly behind her. She looked absolutely devastated, her perfect illusion of extreme wealth completely shattered. She stopped right at the threshold of the heavy double doors and slowly turned around to look at me one final time. The driveway outside was completely empty. The fleet of luxury cars had long since vanished. The repo men had arrived discreetly during the chaos and had already towed away Darius's leased white Maserati. My parents and my sister were now standing awkwardly on the street curb, desperately waiting for a cheap rideshare vehicle because they had absolutely no other way to leave the exclusive gated community. I walked slowly toward the front entrance, standing tall and victorious in my simple beige silk dress. I looked out at the three of them shivering on the sidewalk, entirely stripped of their arrogant pride. Chantel stared at me, her eyes burning with a desperate, wild fury. She could not accept that her designated scapegoat had ultimately won the war. You will die alone. Nia Chantel screamed from the curb, her voice tearing through the quiet neighborhood air. You are a cold, heartless person. You can have all the money in the entire world, but nobody will ever truly love you. I looked at my sister, feeling absolutely nothing but profound, unshakable peace. I did not need to hurl a single insult back at her. Her pathetic, miserable reality was the only punishment she would ever need. I simply smiled, reached out, and firmly pulled the heavy double doors shut. The satisfying metallic click of the heavy deadbolt, locking securely from the inside, echoed loudly, permanently sealing them entirely out of my beautiful, peaceful, and incredibly successful new life forever. I took a long, deep breath of the clean, quiet air, knowing that my absolute freedom from their lifelong suffocating abuse had finally been achieved. They were no longer my problem. They were just ghosts fading. I turned away from the heavy double doors and walked slowly back toward the center of the massive living room. The sheer quiet of the empty villa was absolute perfection. The toxic energy that had suffocated this space just an hour ago was completely gone. Aunt Vivica was waiting for me near the kitchen island. She poured herself one final glass of bourbon and looked around at the abandoned luxury items scattered across the floor. We did not need to exchange a single word to understand the profound magnitude of what had just occurred. The lifelong cycle of generational trauma and financial abuse had been permanently broken tonight. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the commander of my private security team. The guards were already securing the perimeter of the estate, ensuring my family had actually left the neighborhood. I instructed the commander to bring in the overnight crew. They were to immediately change every single lock on every exterior door and window of the property. I also ordered them to catalog all the abandoned designer furniture and silver dining sets my sister tried to steal. Everything was to be packed up and placed into a secure commercial storage facility by tomorrow afternoon. Next, I called my commercial real estate broker. She answered on the first ring. I gave her the exact address of the Buckhead Villa and instructed her to put the property on the luxury market tomorrow morning. I wanted it listed for an immediate all-cash sale. I felt absolutely no emotional attachment to this massive house whatsoever. I had never intended to actually live in it. To me, this $2 million piece of real estate was nothing more than a strategic chess piece. It was a perfectly calculated financial weapon I utilized to trap my abusers, expose their fraud, and dismantle their kingdom. Now that the battle was completely over, the villa was simply another standard asset to be liquidated for high profit. Aunt Vivica raised her crystal glass, proposing a silent, victorious toast to my ruthless efficiency. I clinked my glass against her bourbon, feeling the heavy weight of 32 years lift off my shoulders. Exactly 1 month later, the toxic drama of that unforgettable housewarming party felt like a distant, irrelevant memory. I was sitting at the mahogany desk in my home office, enjoying a cup of black coffee. The morning sunlight streamed beautifully through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. This was my actual true home. It was a stunning, incredibly peaceful, and heavily secured private estate, nestled deep within the lush hills just outside the city. I had purposefully chosen a location heavily surrounded by dense, towering pine trees and tranquil nature. It was miles away from the shallow, materialistic, and deeply toxic high society circles of downtown Atlanta. There were no nosy church deacons here. There were no arrogant socialites judging my beige silk dresses. There was only pure, unadulterated peace. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute quiet, as I opened my laptop to review my financial portfolios. My private equity firm had experienced a massive surge of new, highly lucrative investments over the past 4 weeks. The highly publicized exposure of Darius and his embezzlement scheme actually boosted my corporate reputation tremendously. Wealthy investors across Georgia wanted to conduct business with a chief executive officer who possessed the sharp intelligence required to take down a sophisticated fraud ring. The Buckhead Villa had sold within 3 days of being listed, netting my company a massive, effortless profit. My financial empire was growing stronger and more impenetrable with every passing second. I scrolled through the revenue charts, feeling a sense of total security. I had successfully protected my hard-earned wealth, and I permanently insulated my peaceful life from the destructive forces of my biological family. The logical, real-world consequences of their extreme arrogance and blind greed had caught up to them with brutal speed. I had not needed to lift another finger to destroy them. The strict laws of finance and federal justice had handled the execution perfectly. Darius was currently sitting in a cold federal holding facility, completely denied any chance of bail. The sheer amount of irrefutable evidence Aunt Vivica and I provided to the authorities was entirely overwhelming. The local prosecutors swiftly charged him with multiple counts of severe wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and grand theft. His highly paid defense attorneys immediately dropped him the second they realized his bank accounts were frozen. He was now relying on an overworked public defender to negotiate a plea deal. According to the latest legal reports, Darius was currently facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 long years in federal prison. His flashy days of driving leased sports cars and funding secret mistresses in Miami were permanently over. He would spend the next decade wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit completely stripped of his stolen money. The spectacular downfall of my parents was equally devastating. Pastor Thomas, the man who spent his life commanding absolute respect, had been permanently defrocked. The furious church board of elders showed him absolutely zero mercy. They immediately stripped him of his prestigious pastoral title, revoked his generous pension, and permanently banned him from the holy sanctuary. The massive public scandal completely ruined his pristine reputation across the entire Southern religious community. With his church parsonage seized by my firm and sold off to recover stolen funds, Thomas had been forced to seek desperate employment just to survive. The former grand spiritual leader of Atlanta High Society was now working long hours as a night shift security guard at a rundown commercial warehouse. He spent his agonizing nights walking around empty, freezing parking lots stripped of all his former glory. Mother Beatrice and her golden child Chantel had suffered the harshest reality check of all. Without the stolen church funds to support them, they had been forced out of their luxurious bubbles. They were currently living together in a cramped, heavily dilapidated two-bedroom apartment in a notoriously dangerous low-income neighborhood far outside the city. The irony of their situation was poetic. The two women who constantly mocked my modest clothing were now wearing cheap, worn-out uniforms to their new jobs. Chantel, the former glamorous socialite who refused to let me sleep on her couch, was now working full-time as a minimum-wage cashier at a chaotic discount supermarket. Mother Beatrice was spending her days working the reception desk at a highly stressful, poorly managed dental clinic. They spent their long, exhausting evenings taking crowded public transportation back to their tiny, roach-infested apartment, constantly blaming each other bitterly for their spectacular ruin. The daily misery of their new reality was a direct consequence of their profound greed. Their high society friends had entirely deleted their phone numbers. The prominent church congregation they once aggressively ruled had completely turned their backs on them. They were entirely isolated, utterly broke, and drowning in the heavy consequences of their own toxic actions. I closed the financial portfolio on my laptop, feeling a profound sense of closure. The chaotic chapter of my life involving those people was officially completely closed. I stood up from my heavy mahogany desk and walked out into the bright, sunlit hallway of my peaceful estate. My trusted estate manager, a highly efficient woman named Clara, was waiting near the front entrance with my morning correspondence. She handed me a neat stack of sorted corporate mail and a small silver tray containing my daily schedule. I thanked her warmly and began flipping casually through the envelopes as I walked toward the spacious kitchen to pour myself another cup of imported coffee. Most of the mail consisted of standard business contracts, elegant invitations to corporate charity galas, and thick financial statements. But as I reached the very bottom of the heavy stack, I paused abruptly. I pulled out a cheap, flimsy, heavily crumpled white envelope. It was not a professional corporate document. There was no return address printed in the upper left corner. The postage stamp was crooked, and the front of the envelope was covered in messy, highly frantic, and desperately familiar handwriting. I stared at my own name, written in the frantic, looping cursive script that I immediately recognized as belonging to my sister. I walked over to the gleaming marble kitchen counter and slowly tore the cheap envelope open. I pulled out a single torn piece of lined notebook paper. The handwriting was heavily smudged, likely stained by desperate, frantic tears. I unfolded the paper and read the short, pathetic message scrawled across the cheap page. "Nia, please," the letter begged, the words entirely stripped of any former arrogance or toxic pride. "I know you rightfully hate us. I know we completely ruined everything. But they are going to shut off the power to our apartment tomorrow morning. Mom is sick, and I do not have enough money from the supermarket to cover the overdue balance. Please, my sister Nia, just send me $500 to pay my electric bill." I stared down at the cheap lined notebook paper resting in my hands. The smudged ink carried the desperate pleas of a sister who had spent her entire life trying to destroy my self-esteem. Chantel was begging me for a simple $500 to keep the lights on in her cramped apartment. She claimed our mother was sick. She claimed she was suffering. She deliberately used the word sister to manipulate my emotions desperately, hoping I still carried the deep childhood trauma that used to make me completely compliant. Just a few years ago, receiving a letter like this would have sent me into a severe panic attack. I would have felt the crushing, suffocating guilt that my parents had meticulously programmed into my brain since I was a little girl. I would have instantly transferred the money, sacrificing my own peace of mind, just to buy a temporary fake truce. I would have desperately hoped that my financial sacrifice would finally earn me a tiny shred of genuine maternal love or basic sibling respect. But as I read her frantic, pathetic handwriting today, I realized something truly profound. I felt absolutely nothing at all. There was no lingering anger burning in my chest. There was no vindictive joy or petty satisfaction at seeing her beg. There was just a vast, beautiful, and completely undisturbed emptiness. I calmly folded the piece of notebook paper in half. I walked across my spacious home office toward the sleek, modern paper shredder sitting discreetly next to my heavy mahogany desk. I slid the cheap envelope and the handwritten letter into the top slot. The sharp steel blades whirred to life, instantly pulling the paper down and effortlessly grinding Chantel's desperate manipulation into tiny, unrecognizable shreds of trash. The machine hummed quietly for a few seconds before shutting off, leaving my office in absolute pristine silence once again. That shredded piece of paper was the very last physical tie I had to the deeply toxic people who shared my last name. They thought they could still reach me, but they were completely wrong. I did not need to write a scathing reply or call them to gloat over their massive downfall. Responding to them would only validate their existence in my world. They simply did not exist in my reality anymore. They had been permanently deleted from my life, reduced to absolute nothingness. The true payoff of that spectacular, chaotic night in Buckhead was never actually about the money. The millions of dollars I earned from selling the luxury villa and seizing the church parsonage were just standard corporate transactions. The ultimate victory was achieving this profound, unshakable peace. For my entire life, I had lived in a constant state of high alert, always waiting for the next cruel insult, the next financial demand, or the next public humiliation. My nervous system was constantly hijacked by their endless chaotic drama. Now I woke up every single morning feeling incredibly light. My home was a true sanctuary, completely free from their loud voices and their heavy, suffocating expectations. I had successfully protected my hard-earned wealth, but more importantly, I had aggressively protected my spirit. The vast fortune I built was simply a highly effective tool I used to build an impenetrable fortress around my mental health. I no longer harbored any deep resentment toward Pastor Thomas, Beatrice, or Chantel because they simply did not matter. Their miserable fate was the natural, unavoidable consequence of their own toxic choices. I was completely free to build my future without carrying the heavy, exhausting anchor of their generational trauma dragging behind me. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my office and looked out at the gorgeous, sun-drenched landscape of my private estate. The lush green trees swayed gently in the warm morning breeze. I thought about the thousands of women who might be watching or listening to my story right now. Women who feel completely trapped by the heavy guilt of toxic family dynamics. Society tells Black women that we must carry the weight of our families, that we must tolerate disrespect in the name of blood, and that setting boundaries makes us bitter. But the truth is, your success is your armor. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep toxic people warm. Cut the dead weight, secure your future, and never apologize for outgrowing the people who tried to keep you small. Your peace of mind is your most valuable asset, and you must protect it with absolute ruthless precision. You owe nothing to the people who only value you for what they can extract from you. I turned away from the window and walked out of my office, making my way down the bright open hallway toward the back of the house. The heavy glass doors slid open smoothly, leading out onto a spectacular sun-drenched stone patio overlooking a sparkling infinity pool. Aunt Vivica was already sitting at a small patio table, wearing a luxurious silk robe and oversized designer sunglasses. She held a chilled crystal glass filled with fresh orange juice and premium champagne. She looked up at me and smiled broadly, her face radiating the exact same unbothered, wealthy peace that I felt in my own heart. I picked up my own freshly poured mimosa from the table and sat down in the comfortable lounge chair right beside her. We raised our crystal glasses toward the bright, cloudless sky, celebrating our beautiful drama-free reality. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp morning air fill my lungs entirely. I was finally standing firmly in my own power, surrounded by nothing but pure serenity. The battle was entirely over, and I had undeniably won my absolute freedom forever today, and always. We gently clinked our mimosa glasses together, the crisp, clear sound ringing out across the quiet estate as the camera slowly fades to black.